The approved school, an institution for children once considered delinquent or beyond their parents' control. In truth, these homes were the state's way of handling thousands of Britain's most vulnerable and neglected youngsters. A BBC film crew captured the tone of life at one in 1969.
Will you say grace, please?
What we have just received may make us truly thankful.
Stand.
Into this kind of environment came Peter Wrighton, a serial abuser of children who'd quietly left a teaching job in the early 1960s amid complaints of abuse, and who would later become a founding member of the now notorious Peadophile information exchange.
Adults would feel that a developed consideration for children would involve leaving children alone sexually to find their own way for themselves with their own peer groups and not with adults.
Wrighton hid all this behind a respectable career as an academic training social workers and childcare staff. He became increasingly influential and not only had access to children, but we've discovered became part of the policy process deciding how children's homes should be run.
Yes, I would be all in favour of children finding their own way sexually, but I think also that adults have a part to play because children are one part of the whole society. It isn't the society where we separate children.
He had a script to follow to educate people in children's homes.
We've spoken to a former care professional familiar with Wrighton who's asked not to be identified and whose voice is not used here.
He was going under the guise of improving social work, especially residential work. He was encouraged to go and interview individual boys in approved schools. He certainly went to talk to the heads of homes. He went all over the country. He went to so many places. He networked. He was a very dangerous man because he was put in a position where he could abuse trust.
By the children from adults. What do you feel?
I feel that PI is not a procurement agency for children, never has been and never will be. Our political objectives include developing a society where children are given a much higher status than today, where they're recognised as individuals in their own right.
In the early 1970s, Wrighton's work had been used by the government. This programme has seen a Home Office report authored by an advisory team in its then Children's Department, in which Wrighton is credited for his considerable assistance. The report set out plans for major reforms to approved schools, replacing them with the now more familiar residential children's homes.
And this includes recognising their right to certain sexual freedoms, whilst protecting them from the kind of criminal assaults which took place in Brighton.
A more liberal system, with responsibility for care being passed from the government to local authorities. It required the hiring and training of hundreds of new social care staff, Wrighton's area of specialism.
But surely it's a question of recognising children's maturity, and how can you have an equal relationship, which is what I take a mature sexual relationship to be, between an adult and a child who is not mature in body, in mind, or personal awareness?
The fourth chapter of this report on staff training credits Wrighton.
Ian Pace is a lecturer at City University who researches issues of institutionalised abuse.
Some of Wrighton's interests certainly seem to be reflected here. He wrote extensively about the role of residential workers in childcare, and he in particular tried to sort of accelerate a process that was already in motion, that had moved away from the idea of having surrogate parents in childcare.
In a more bizarre passage in the part of the report that credits Wrighton, the Home Office study says childcare staff should be trained in
basic information about the organisation of primitive communities and the growth of civilization,
and
the significance of aesthetic values.
Now we know
It has to be unequal.
I don't accept that this concept of maturity at all. Adults, for instance, aren't necessarily mature. It's a long process.
I take it for granted that no adult is probably ever mature, but nevertheless my state of maturity, or your state of maturity, is clearly different from that of a child of 12.
that Wrighton was a classics scholar from Oxford, very interested in the classical world, very interested in Greek mythology, and almost certainly deeply involved with the cult of the classical world that was very important to a large number of people in the paedophile movement.
How can there be an equal relationship which allows them sex, which is usually a shocking experience for everybody at some time or another? How can you allow an equal relationship between two people so unequally positioned at the starting off point?
I don't accept that sex is a spontaneously shocking experience.
I don't think at some stage or other there is an element of shocking sex.
Not if children are properly educated about sex, and it's an obligation on society to see that children are given a far more comprehensive sexual education.
Especially coming out of a book published in the 1960s called Greek Love, the term used for love between men and young boys.
So here you have a Home Office research study, which itself then talks about, social workers needing to be trained in the growth of civilization, in aesthetic values. I mean, it seems incredible, really.
It's absolutely incredible. And also, just as incredible is how long Wrighton was able to stay active and highly respected in the profession.
From a far earlier age.
But in that case, they find it out. They discover this with people of their own age and in their own time. And it is the question of inequality, which I come back to, which I think you haven't answered.
Indeed, by your lights, the relationship is unequal in the same way that a teacher-child relationship is unequal, in the same way that a parent-child relationship is unequal.
The teacher's not exploiting the child sexually.
And nor is a pedophile. Pedophiles do not exploit children. Child molesters
using the child's sexuality.
About half of you stood at the right time, but very slowly. Sit down again.
It is impossible to know much of the conversations Wrighton was having with staff on his visits to these kinds of approved schools. The former care professional we spoke to says Wrighton travelled extensively, specifically naming Rochdale, Preston and Bryneston in Wrexham, later embroiled in a major abuse scandal.
No, pedophiles do not use a child's sexuality. Pedophiles develop a mutual sexuality with the child. It's an entirely reciprocal relationship.
But you can't say that because of this business of immaturity and the inequality of the relationship.
More than 140 children were alleged to have been assaulted over a decade-long period. The former care professional told us it was only years later, when Wrighton's abuse came to light, that the significance of an earlier conversation with him became apparent, recalling that Wrighton had said he took boys out in Wrexham and said he spoke of using sexual language with them that
was not something you would have in a healthy conversation with a child.
But the definition of maturity is yours. We don't share it.
Well, what is your definition of maturity in this context? Now, how can a child of 12 make a mature judgment about something like sex for the first time, which it has not the first idea about, and cannot possibly weigh the consequences of it?
List of local authorities whose homes were used as supply lines for abusers in the 70s and 80s is tragically long, and what role, if any, Wrighton had in precipitating some of it is likely to be a question for the forthcoming overarching inquiry into historical abuse.
You're imputing to a sexual relationship heavy judgmental issues which
I'm talking about the physical and psychical response.
Yes, a child is able to recognise a pleasurable experience. He is able to recognise a pleasing emotional experience. He is able to express consent and to recognise that this is something he wishes to continue. And a responsible, caring pedophile, it always refers to the wishes of the child.
Peter Wrighton died a free man in 2007. The Home Office declined to comment on the latest revelations about him, but referred us to the Home Secretary's announcement last month of 2 separate inquiries into the handling of abuse claims.
That was Tom Bateman reporting. And a reminder that if you know anything about those events, you can contact the programme. Our email address is today@bbc.co.uk.
You were given the job of chairing the government's historical child abuse inquiry. You were given the job and you held it for a while before you were effectively forced to stand down, which is exactly what happened to the second chair. Do you regret taking that job on?
No, I thought it was my duty. I didn't want to do the job, but it was one that needed to be done.
looking at tapes or a tape that has been hidden for many years by the government, secret services, whoever, of Leon Britton abusing young boys. So it isn't just Tony Blair's government, it's Margaret Thatcher's government. And Leon Britton, I'll say it again, was a regular visitor to Elm Guest House at the same time as Gary Walker, who was heavily a leader of Sinn Féin and the IRA, while bombs were going off on the streets of this country. I'm sorry, I'm getting angry now. While bombs were going off on the streets in this country, and people were being accused of this and that, while these two, our Home Secretary and the leader of Sinn Féin and the IRA, were messing about with children at Elm Guest House and worse. And we're now going into the detail of snuff movies. A witness I'm working with was asked if he knew anything about a snuff movie where a young child was decapitated. So it's going a lot deeper, Lou, and I asked Nick Clegg that question 4 years ago, Lou.
Yeah. Bill, can we just quickly go on? What happened on the BBC this morning? Because obviously I came straight into the studio and I've just been...
I thought I had the qualifications. It never crossed my mind that my brother would be an impediment. I didn't know that he'd ever been given a dossier by Geoffrey Dickens. That was not something when I was a judge. I followed what my brother was doing as Attorney General.
Well, we should explain that he was Attorney General, as your late brother. He was Attorney General, and it was partly as a result of the timing of that there were concerns as to whether you could be impartial.
Well, that seemed to me to be an attack on my integrity. As a judge, I would expect to be totally impartial, even with my own family. I saw...
Smiles up. Nick, 4 years ago, I asked you, what were you going to do about institutional paedophiles operating in this country now?
On the 5th of November 1979, the son of the chauffeur at the Australian High Commission in London went missing. The disappearance of Martin Allen sparked a massive manhunt, but he was never found. Did he run away or was he abducted? As each decade has passed, small strands of evidence have appeared, many of them suggesting that Martin Allen might have been taken by a pedophile ring with links to people high up in the British establishment, including MPs at Westminster. Several people trying to investigate the allegations have now been told to stop asking questions. Reporter Mary Gearan tracked them down, trying to put together the pieces of this most baffling case.
Great power, potentially bringing great abuse.
Repeatedly, police investigations into child abuse across Britain were being stopped by people in senior positions, and it's one of the critical questions we want answers to.
Or no difficulty, but we live in a world of perception, Sarah. Nobody looks at the reality, they look at how they feel about things.
There was another issue which was reported on, not least by the Times, who quoted somebody who had brought, when you had carried out a review of abuse allegations within the Church of England. There were two priests who had been abusing at least one individual. He also mentioned to you allegations of abuse against a bishop, and he quoted you as saying that you would prefer not to refer to this bishop in the report because you cared about the church.
Who stopped it and why?
At the centre of this scandal are accounts of pedophile parties for prominent establishment figures, abusing children, mostly boys. Many of the claims are linked to this place, Dolphin Square, an apartment block near the Houses of Parliament, while MP Cyril Smith, who died in 2010, has been named as one of several politicians to have abused boys at another location, Elm Guest House in South London.
You know, it was a group of people that obviously had a particular sexual appetite, which is unacceptable.
And then it can stay in my eyes.
Talking about taxes, thanks very much.
Well, they're naming Cyril Smith and they're saying the Liberal Democrat leader, the Liberal Democrat Party and the Labour Party have got questions to answer about paedophilia, institutional paedophilia within councils, within government.
Okay.
And he's banging on their door now, Lou.
So hang on a minute.
They can't hide anymore.
No, they can't hide.
Lou, can I just say that this is all because of victims that are coming forward. So you victims that are out there, you come forward because you're now witnesses.
Absolutely untrue. I said I preferred not to I said I cared about the church. I also said, would he like me to refer to the bishop? Because at that time there was no evidence in Chichester that linked him to abuse.
Disgraceful.
It's starting to rain.
The brother of one missing boy is sure of a connection to the sickening events.
He was probably mistreated and abused for maybe a couple of months and thrown away just like a rag doll.
Kevin Allen still misses his little brother Martin, once Britain's most famous missing boy. The family once lived on the grounds of Australia's High Commission in London.
And, you know, this fight, we're taking this right into the heart. We are in the battlefield now, and swords and sabres are clashing.
Absolutely.
And we will not back down.
No, I mean, we
As
also...
victims and survivors of institutional child abuse, the people, when your audience, Lou, when they start watching the news today and they see what's happening, they will understand my temperament at the moment, if you like.
Absolutely.
And that's what I would like to say to all you institutional paedophile rings that are happening, that were involved in these atrocities that were happening. We said we're coming to get you, and it's not even started yet.
Or not sufficient evidence for me to refer to it in a report. But I said to this young man, your story should be given. If I refer to the bishop, the whole of the press will be interested in the bishop and not in your story.
Their father Thomas was chief chauffeur for more than a decade. Family happy snaps show their bird's eye view of London's hoi polloi. But everything changed for the Allens when 15-year-old Martin went missing on November the 5th, 1979, as he took the tube to another brother's place.
First of all, he was treated like a missing kid, and then sort of word got out that there was the embassy link, and then I think that sort of oiled the wheels a bit.
The only clue was one witness report of a man with his hand on a nervous-looking boy on the tube. It came to nothing. Heartbreaking days turned into weeks and months. Then 17-year-old Kevin Allen received a jolt when he floated one theory past a visiting policeman.
And I just said that hired people must have taken him. Someone sorted him away. And the detective said to me, if you keep saying things like that, you could get hurt.
Now, the Labour MP for Rochdale, Simon Danchuk, recently published a book, Smile for the Camera.
What do you want me to do? And he wanted his story to go further and agreed with me that I should not refer to the bishop. That's not the story he's given since.
What it has resulted in is people suggesting that actually what it shows is that you are effectively part of the establishment.
Double Life of Cyril Smith. It detailed his investigation into allegations of child abuse surrounding his Liberal predecessor. Now he's been contacted by those involved in other investigations. And today he spoke to our reporter Becky Milligan about those investigations and the effect they've had on him.
Listening to some of the stories, but I make this point, it's never as harrowing as what the victims have been through. We have regular conversations with people who've ended up on drugs. It's really ruined their lives. We hear about people who've committed suicide, and so when people say, "Oh, these victims are just coming forward to try and get some compensation," let me tell you, all the money in the world wouldn't.
And you believe that this was the detective shutting down something because he knew something?
I believe so, yes, definitely.
Last year, an anonymous man known as Nick came forward to claim from the age of 7 to 16 he was driven to Dolphin Square to be horrendously abused. He also claims to have witnessed 3 boys murdered, one by a Tory MP, another murdered in front of a former cabinet minister. Scotland Yard has called the claims credible and true. Police won't confirm if Martin Allen is one of the murdered boys, but officers involved in that investigation have interviewed Kevin. And you're sure that Martin's case is linked to this so-called VIP abuse ring?
Yes, definitely. Definitely.
Sorry.
That's all right, Simon. I know it's really harrowing. Are you okay?
The Rochdale MP Simon Danchuk talking to our reporter Becky Milligan earlier.
Wanting to protect institutions like the Church of England.
No, I am a member of the Church of England and I'm proud of that. But my report was extremely critical of 2 priests. I also wrote another report, which is not published, which referred to people who at that time had not been accused of any offences, who I thought ought to be looked at. Since then, some of them have actually come before the courts.
I have little doubt that this is connected in. Exactly who, how, when, where, I don't know.
To another story, and the Jimmy Savile sex scandal at the BBC and with the police is rumbling on. 7 times, apparently, the police let Jimmy Savile off. That's the headlines of many of the newspapers today. But this was raised on Wednesday by Tom Watson in the House of Commons at Prime Minister's Questions. And if you listen carefully, you can hear a lot of the Conservative people at the very beginning, when Tom Watson stands up to speak, making sort of animal noises at him. But anyway, let's hear what he had to say.
Watson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The evidence file used to convict paedophile Peter Wrighton, if it still exists, contains clear intelligence of a widespread paedophile ring. One of its members boasts of his links to a senior aide of a former Prime Minister who says he could smuggle indecent images of children from abroad.
Do you have sympathy, though, with this view, which seems to be that there is an establishment, and it is an establishment that is protecting itself, and that if we are ever to get to the bottom of what has happened and the abuse that we know has happened at high levels, that it has to be somebody from outside and truly independent who is chairing?
Labor MP John Mann has been campaigning on this subject for years. His own investigations were stymied in 1989 when, as a councillor in Lambeth, just over the river from Westminster, he gave police evidence pointing to the abuse of children from local care homes in the area, at least one of whom now says he was taken to Dolphin Square.
And for 3 months they investigated, and then the investigating officers told me they'd been instructed by people on high in the police to stop all investigations, despite the fact we had a lot of documents and a lot of evidence, and that was that.
Mann has now passed to police a dossier naming 22 politicians accused of involvement in the paedophile ring.
Leads were not followed up, but if the files still exist, I want to ensure that the Metropolitan Police secure the evidence, re-examine it, and investigate clear intelligence suggesting a powerful paedophile network linked to Parliament and Number 10.
But the most prominent paedophile associated with the Savile ring was a man called Edward Heath, who you may recall was Prime Minister.
There are people still involved in public life who ought not to be, and who ought to be in front of the courts.
I think Lambeth was something like the 5th or 6th largest police service.
Clive Driscoll has also faced high-level resistance to his uncomfortable questions. The retired Scotland Yard detective has had a long and distinguished career that almost went off track in 1998, soon after he started probing into alleged abuse at Lambeth children's homes involving prominent figures.
First of all, I do believe that the establishment has in the past looked after itself. I think partly because people did not really recognise the seriousness of child abuse. and they didn't think that it was so important, and it was more important to protect members of the establishment. So I would want to go in with a knife and cut the whole thing open and expose it as to what happened, bearing in mind, of course, that the views of people in those days are not the views of people today.
Focus into the EEC. Heath was into little boys, and Saville was supplying them. A number of these boys were taken out of the Haute de Garenne home in Jersey. Saville was taking children from a children's home with the support of German assets in Jersey. What was happening was that children's homes in the Channel Islands, particularly Haute de Garenne in Jersey, children were being taken from these homes, boys in the case of Edward Heath, as he was gay, and a paedophile, were being taken onto his yacht, the Morning Cloud. Saville was actually going out he went down to Jersey, and he was actually taking boys. There was another man involved as well, but Saville himself took boys.
Sort of within 2 weeks of that investigation starting, that I was asked to attend Barnes Police Station, whereupon it was suggested to me that I'd mentioned certain names as suspects, which I had. 100% had said them, and as a result of that, they removed me from post immediately.
An old-fashioned officer, he still can't say what happened to him constituted a cover-up, but he still wonders what might have been.
But the person who actually interviewed him, he said, "I'm really sorry, I feel quite shabby about this." So it wasn't everybody, but I just, at the time, it didn't actually make a lot of sense.
And that is a difficulty. But I don't believe that I was unsuitable to do it, because in principle, as a judge with the experience of 35 years on the bench, I was quite able to be independent and to say that people had got it wrong and to be critical of them.
Even if it was found that they were people who were very close to you?
From the children's home, where he was a guest, or welcome, on to the boat. So he was taking boys out onto Morning Cloud. Now, since Heath was well known, and since the boys were talking young men, the boys were murdered and thrown off the boat. That's why the BBC and the Cabinet Office have been so keen to protect Saville. That's why the Cabinet Office in the 1980s were willing to back Saville to the point of giving him a position of authority at Broadmoor, which is an absolute, you don't put a paedophile in charge of Broadmoor. The Cabinet Secretary at the time, who thankfully is no longer with us, Hunt, was also a paedophile, was in on this, met Saville, he was Catholic, met Saville, as did that very nice man, the late Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Basil Hume.
Yes, but as a judge, that is the way I was trained. But I do absolutely understand that the public don't believe it.
Can I just, final question on that, can it ever get off the ground, this inquiry?
Driscoll had received information from Liverpool, the precinct that reportedly uncovered a shrine to Martin Allen at a local pedophile's home. But he can't say his unpursued evidence would have shed light on that case. The former policeman is optimistic by nature about the system, but he says even now many officers won't speak out.
No, there is fear. I mean, I've had police officers contact me personally, and I think they would dearly love to come forward, but there is fear. There is immense fear.
The only answer is to find more people willing to tell their story.
There will be people in Australia today who left Britain because of the abuse they had as children in order to start a new life and getting away from it. And what we need is any bit of information, any bit of evidence, whether they decide to go public, whether they decide to prosecute or not, can be vital.
Kevin Allen has been left deeply cynical. His father in particular suffered.
He used to go out with the dog and shed his tears, and be upset over Hyde Park. And in later life, when he retired, he'd go over the woods with the dog and sit on his favourite tree stump with the dog and bawl his eyes out.
There are far more lives that have been scarred and ruined by childhood abuse. Let the truth come out.
I don't know. I worry that the victims survivors for whom I have the most enormous sympathy. And as a judge, I tried a great many child abuse cases. I really have huge sympathy for them. But for them to be deciding who should become the person chairing it creates real problems.
Basil was not a paedophile, but knew Hunt and had a shrewd idea. He wasn't stupid. He had a shrewd idea of what had been going on, and I've no doubt was told to keep a lid on it. Hunt was in on it, so the Cabinet Secretary at the time was in on it, was aware of what was going on, was aware he had a Prime Minister who was involved not just in abusing young boys, but was murdering them as well. It's quite possible that there was a crewman on the yacht who did the actual murder. I'm not saying Ebert Heath necessarily bashed the boys on the boko and tossed them overboard. He may have had somebody do that for him, but he was certainly guilty of murder under English law as an accessory or on the joint enterprise basis. Oh, if someone is inclined in that direction and you can supply them with boys, then you've got a hold on them, or girls. There's nothing worse for a politician than being exposed in the murder and sexual abuse of young people. And if you've got a politician who is abusing and killing young girls and boys, but boys or girls, then you've got a hold on them.
Because if you do not have, in the past, a position of authority, how are you going to be able to run the inquiry? You need someone who knows how to run things. And if you get someone from an obscure background with no background of establishment, they'll find it very difficult and may not be able, actually, to produce the goods.
Paedophilia is a wonderful means, if you're a hostile intelligence agency, of blackmailing politicians. The reason it's particularly disgusting, quite aside from the element of sexual abuse and coercion and corruption of young people, that's disgusting in and of itself. But what makes it particularly vile, and we saw this in the Madeleine McCann case, and that's why the Madeleine McCann case was so heartbreaking and tragic, if the children are, and I'm afraid with paedophilia we sometimes have babies being abused, but if you're not talking babies, if you're talking toddlers who are able to recognize the people who are abusing them, since the people, there's absolutely no point doing it unless the politician is high profile, since you're talking about people who are on television, people who are high profile, you have to murder the children in order to protect your asset. So for the Germans, it was essential that the boys that were being taken onto the yacht, that was a death ride. When Jimmy Savile was taking, let's say, a 14-year-old boy down to Morning Cloud, handing him over to Ebert Heath or a member of the crew on the yacht, it was a death ride. That was that boy's last journey on Earth.
There's a real question that you raised there about the role of victims, for whom, as you've said, not least because of your own experience, you have a great deal of sympathy. The question of how much a victim culture can begin to take over an inquiry of this case, and that someone who feels very strongly, is part very disturbed because of an experience they've had, is sort of automatically believed simply because it's such a terrible experience, and suddenly the normal processes of sifting evidence, worrying about proper judgments, sort of goes by the board.
Yes, you're right. There is a real difficulty about this. Of course, the victims are at the centre of this, as Theresa May said, hugely to her credit that she wanted this inquiry. But if the victims are to run it, then I think there will be real difficulties.
Over recent days, the Daily Mail has splashed its front pages about the Labour deputy leader, her husband, Shadow Minister Jack Dromey, and the former Labour Health Secretary Patricia Hewitt. All three worked for the National Council for Civil Liberties in the 1970s and 80s. The council, now known as the human rights organisation Liberty, was linked to the Peadophile Information Exchange, a group which campaigned for paedophiles' rights. It even argued to lower the age of consent to 10. Ms Harman became the legal officer at the NCCL in 1978, and her name appears on documents submitted to the Home Office that argued that pictures of naked children should not be banned as indecent unless it could be proved that the child had been harmed.
So what do you think is, just on that before we move, I mean, this must be something that throughout, as a result of your career, you feel very passionate about. As you watch it going on, do you wish that you had had a chance to get in and cut it out, as you say?
I have two feelings. One is, I think, without sounding arrogant, I probably could have done the job.
Harriet Harman, you were the legal officer for several years at the National Council for Civil Liberties, which was affiliated to the Peadophile Information Exchange. But why was it acceptable even to have an affiliation? They didn't try to hide what they were. The title of the group was the Peadophile Information Exchange. Why was it okay for them even to have any link with the group you worked for? At the time when you were the legal officer there, you wrote in a briefing paper to MPs, and we have it here, that prosecutions in relation to child protection and photography should only proceed if you can prove that children were actually harmed. Can you see why people might raise an eyebrow? Was the affiliation between the two groups a mistake?
Well, NCCL takes money from any organisation which was a lawful organisation and any individual.
You're happy that your employer for 4 years took membership money from a group that was overtly campaigning for the rights of paedophiles. That wasn't a mistake. That's what you're saying.
You know, I stand by what I was doing at NCCL, and I stand by what I've done all the way through.
The second is, I'm so glad I haven't got to do it yet.
Just on the victim point, you've been very interesting on this. Do you think the victims should be on the panel?
Oh yes, I believe there has to be a victim voice on the panel.
I encountered Kenneth Clark MP, and when I did so, when I met him at Ian Greer's office, he molested me. He put his hand on my penis and kept it there. They hadn't spoken to Kenneth Clark MP, and they said they wouldn't be speaking to him because he was above the law. It was videotaped because it was the Cook Report. We videotaped everything. So we had a jacket camera and we had a suitcase camera. And when I was in the room, the suitcase camera I think went on the sofa opposite, and I had the jacket camera on. Now you can't see anything with the jacket camera because obviously someone comes in and touches you that way, but on the suitcase camera you saw it. And when I got the tapes back to the we were staying in a place called the Hyde Park Residence, they played the tapes, and the producers sat there and they watched it, and I watched it. So I know that they knew that I'd been molested by Kenneth Clark MP. John Major knew what we were doing, found out about it, and got Carlton Communications to buy Central Television to get hold of the Cook Report tapes, to get hold of the tape of Kenneth Clark molesting me in Ian Greer's office as well. So these tapes were taken by Carlton Communications. John Major said, well, the scandal was so huge it was going to bring down the Conservative government. got Carlton Communications, who was a client of Ian Greer at the time, to do him a favour, which was to buy Central Television, which we were planning to do anyway, but much later. Because they were going to buy sort of all the little small independent television stations.
So you could get that film footage?
To get that film footage. Now, the man who did the actual getting of the tapes was Prime Minister David Cameron.
But the victims should not be running the panel and should not be challenged.
We've just got a minute or so left. I don't know if you enjoyed your experience of editing the programme.
I've loved it. It's been huge fun. You've been very good to me and you've been very kind, and I've had the most marvellous experience.
We've been following, of course, the tweet.
He worked for Carlton Communications. He was Michael Green, the CEO's right-hand man, and he handled it. So when the police went to David Cameron to say about questioning Kenneth Clarke, guess what he said?
Downing Street is in hot water over allegations that it attempted to sweep under the rug the arrest of a close aide of the Prime Minister over a child pornography probe. The official, part of whose role was to advise online porn filters, was reportedly warned that police were investigating him hours before he was detained. RT's Laura Smith has the details.
His name is Patrick Rock, and he is in fact, though, a veteran Conservative Party advisor.
A high-ranking UK official says reports of child abuse and alleged murders at Westminster, which have emerged so far, are only the tip of the iceberg, suggesting that more revelations are likely. Home Secretary Theresa May has blamed institutions protecting children's rights for not fulfilling their duties. She noted that the UK should get to the truth of pedophilia at the heart of government.
Police, who is handling the case himself, is not wavering in his resolve to find the mastermind, popularly known as Madam 1000.
She's still on the run, but I did promise wherever she's hiding, I will get at her anytime, anyway. She must definitely be brought to justice.
The Imo State government is not taking this lightly.
This does not only happen in Imo State, it's everywhere in the country. But in Imo here, we are determined to expose them, and we don't see it as bringing bad image to the state. No exposure of evil should be considered a minus to any state.
And as I speak to you, the government has taken charge of those 22 victims. The 3 individuals who are the suspects are in police custody.
The parents of these girls are believed to be unaware of their location, and all attempts to reach them proved abortive.
Cameron's Deputy Chief of Staff, he's been called Cameron's fixer, and he's had what one might call unparalleled access to power over a very long time, over the last 4 decades, right there in the heart of government. The irony lies in the fact that he's also been closely involved in drawing up government policy on internet pornography filters. And this is a man who was arrested recently on suspicion of what everybody's calling an offence related to child abuse images. So not just pornography, but what appears to be child pornography.
Her statements come after allegations that records of child sex abuse by politicians were deliberately removed or destroyed by the Home Office. Among the latest allegations are that police may have helped cover up the murder of an 8-year-old boy by a Westminster pedophile ring.
Now, his arrest happened on February the 12th and he then resigned, but this was all on the quiet. Downing Street appears to have covered it up until it was confronted with it now. So for the last 3 weeks, no one's known anything about this, but apart from the Prime Minister, who apparently has known for 3 weeks, he said he was very concerned that the matter should be handled correctly, that he didn't want to brief preemptively on a criminal investigation against a member of his staff. But his critics, who are mainly Labour members of Parliament, so opposition, say that this raises a number of questions. For example, what level of security did Patrick Rock have? Is there other stuff that we don't know about? It's also emerged, by the way, that Rock had previously been accused of sexual harassment, which was dealt with by his boss boss at Downing Street, so a political figure rather than a civil servant figure, not very usual. So again, some sort of oddity going on there. The Prime Minister's being accused of a cover-up, and his Labour critics say that this undermines the entire credibility and effectiveness of the government.
To get the latest on that, we're now joined by Mohammed Walji, Press TV's correspondent, who's joining us live now from London itself. Now, Mohammed, Theresa May, they're pointing a lot of fingers at child rights institutions, but I imagine there are quite a few fingers pointing at her too, to make sure that she does the right thing to hold people accountable.
Well, as you mentioned, you know, there are allegations of sexual abuse by MPs, and obviously the murder of 3 children as well, 3 boys. It's something that's quite shocking, and I think Theresa May had to come forward and say that this was a serious issue. And I think
Shepherd this morning. Now, it's not somebody that you know, I know that, but you do feel passionately that rural affairs, that the countryside is not represented.
My main home is in a tiny village, rural village in East Devon, and I think that we do not consider agriculture and the country sufficiently. If you've noticed, the government department talks about rural affairs, it doesn't talk about agriculture. And that it's time to get back to recognising the importance of the country as an agricultural country and not just for rural affairs.
I think she's also trying to deal with a situation that's going to come up in the future, because there will be revelations, I'm sure, in the future, which do show more MPs and more VIPs in the government that have been responsible for sexual abuse with children.
When are individual cases too much? When is pain too much? I can assure you I've seen enough individual cases, and there are at least one Belgian journalist who has seen enough individual cases, and there is one journalist, Christopher Booker, who writes regularly about individual cases. But nothing changes, and nothing has changed in the UK. That's why we are here today. We are here crying for help. There are children screaming to be heard. If you don't hear those children scream, who will?
Let's just go straight into it, right? Let's go straight into it. The witness that I'm talking to from Operation Fernbridge made 2 films of Jimmy Savile. Right. 2 very special films of Jimmy Savile. In one of those films, he was abusing a dead young girl in a mortuary. In the other film, he was filming a dead young boy.
Sidney Cook was a friend
with Jimmy Savile.
Of Jimmy Savile.
And actually involved in murder as well. She said yesterday on a programme that she was determined to ensure that all the issues were fully investigated, and that she is working with the police.
Robert Maxwell was a paedophile, and that is it. And Robert Maxwell is now dead. And Robert Maxwell, our witness, had actually had a sexual encounter with Robert Maxwell and been on his boat quite a few times and seen many powerful people there from the media. You know, it's a horrendous story. And then we've got a picture of Prince Andrew with his arm around an underage prostitute, Charles Napier.
Charles Napier was paedophile information exchange, because I've been looking since, you know, you and I had that conversation about a month ago. I started looking who this Charles Napier is. I believe he had a boat which kids would go onto the boat, and they'd go a sailing boat, and then people would
but they weren't just any kids. He had Down syndrome kids and disabled kids on that boat. At the guy who's in charge, DCI Settle, he's the guy in charge of Operation Fernbridge.
Right.
That's his name. The guy who's in charge, DCI Settle, he's the guy in charge of Operation Fernbridge.
Right.
That's his name. Right. He's a detective inspector, Settle. He was head of the Royal Protection. He used to protect the Queen. Why? Why are you there, Settle? Why are you there? Why have you told Andrew he's not allowed to talk about the royals?
We had the police commissioner Bernard Hogan Howe say that Scotland Yard is taking the claims very, very seriously, and he has put around 40 detectives to investigate these historic child abuse allegations as well. So it's something that they are taking seriously.
Whatever depths you can go to, we were there. Now, I specialise in institutional child abuse. been talking to a few of you, and I've been doing this for quite a few years now. You know, I went into the dramatic film game to earn the big bucks and to be a filmmaker. But this came back on me when my sister was found dead in her apartment after a documentary film I shot called Sun, Sea and Satan. And in Sun, Sea and Satan, I am accusing the establishment, the institutions and the Crown of killing my sister. Now, when I was making Sun, Sea and Satan, when I was shooting this film on the island of Jersey, it's about Hope de la Garenne, where there was a massive establishment cover-up and many of the children were being killed. I don't know if you remember, they found teeth in the cellar and bits and pieces of kids lying about and victims giving statements that were ignored and are still ignored. And
we had a Labour MP actually come forward and say he actually also expects that there will be arrests very soon in the near future of these officials that have been involved in sexual abuse with children that have killed as well.
There was a newspaper article in the Irish World yesterday about me, and it said that I was going to commit treason. Well, it's saying that I have a victim underneath the man here. If I had, say, telling you people here in the middle of Trafalgar Square that I have a very reliable victim. You have 800 priests, clergymen that live in the Vatican City. Nobody else lives there or stays there. They are celibate. Now, celibacy means you don't have sex. Why do they need an age of consent if they don't have sex? And I'm very angry. I am very angry.
Good evening. BBC South East Today has discovered that the Church of England has conducted a secret investigation into a former Sussex bishop who is also a close friend of Prince Charles. The Right Reverend Peter Ball has close ties to the royal family and was the Bishop of Lewes for 15 years.
But he resigned in disgrace in 1993 after committing an act of gross indecency against a teenager. We now understand that a dossier of information about the bishop has been sent to Sussex Police for review.
So let's just reiterate the strength of feeling that emerged at that meeting, principally survivors and survivors' representatives there in conversation with officials from that child sex abuse inquiry. Peter Saunders was the main voice speaking after the meeting from the National Association of People Abused in Childhood, and he made these comments a few moments ago.
Our Home Affairs correspondent Colin Campbell has the exclusive story.
With great penitence and sorrow, the circumstances that have led to this police caution.
After his resignation, the bishop was provided with a grace and favour home in Somerset by Prince Charles. He also read a homily at the funeral of Camilla Parker Bowles' father in 2006. Now 80, Bishop Peter Ball continued working in churches until 2010. In a statement, Sussex Police told us the reports and files they've received relate to matters more than 20 years ago, and that the contents will be reviewed in order to establish whether any police investigation of possible criminal offences would be merited.
We agreed pretty much unanimously that the current chair of the inquiry, Fiona Wolf, is someone that we would not be able to work with were she to remain in place. We also, and I think probably Ali from Lead Day will be able to speak of the legal matters better, but we also feel that it's essential that this becomes a statutory inquiry with statutory powers. Otherwise, it renders the whole thing what is the point. And the remit also, we want the remit extended beyond just England and Wales, because this is a nationwide scourge that's affected many children.
We also have to look at, right now sexual abuse is at the forefront in the United Kingdom, especially after allegations made against Jimmy Savile that he was responsible for several cases of sexual abuse. And I think the government is now trying to deal with the problem that they're facing as well.
and the terms of reference also need to be looked at very carefully. But I think that's something that Ali or Liz would be able to comment more sort of appropriately on, being legal academia people. But we've had a meeting, and I think there will be follow-up meetings, but we've had a voice today, and I think that was really, really important. And we now wait for the feedback from the Home Secretary, who we are assured is going to be fed with our thoughts and feelings immediately. Obviously, they are constrained in all sorts of ways, Andy. They are constrained. One thing that came across was that most of the survivor organisations, again, representing many other survivors, we're just a few voices. But
Queen Elizabeth actually agreed to place all Anglican clergy under the Catholic policy known as Crimen Solicitanis. That basically orders Anglican priests now, along with Catholic priests, to cover up child abuse. What she just did by that was violated her coronation oath, where she swore to protect the citizens of England. She has agreed now to cover up child rape. This is like an official criminal conspiracy. And naturally, us exposing that puts them in a really dangerous position.
But there are millions of survivors. The current panel have all put their support behind Fiona Woolf, which of course compromises them in a way, but they did courteously listen to us, and they could hardly turn round at this point and say, we don't have faith in our boss, which in effect is what she is at the moment. But I think they listened sort of loud and clear, so we wait with interest as to the next move by the Home Secretary and or Fiona Woolf.
So that was Peter Saunders from the National Association for People Abused in Childhood after that meeting. Let's get some reaction now. Keith Vaz, MP, is the chair of the Home Affairs Committee, joins us from Nottingham. Good afternoon, Mr Vaz.
Good afternoon, Julian.
On the strength of what you have just heard, what do you say Fiona Woolf should do now?
Mohammed, just as briefly, if you can tell us, I imagine that bringing forth any case will be very tough, especially considering some records have even been destroyed about such crimes.
Well, to be frank, I didn't hear any of it, so I don't know what the conclusions were.
Well, let me help you on that. They're absolutely clear that they don't want her to be the chair of this committee.
Well, this is obviously a very serious development, which I'm sure she and the Home Secretary will want to consider very carefully. As we've said in the past, the role of the committee has been to try and get as much information into the public domain about what has been a very chaotic appointment system. And the meeting with the victims was extremely important as part of that process. To be frank, this should have been done before the appointment process began, rather than now, after we have been told of the letters that have been exchanged between the Home Secretary, her officials and Mrs. Woolf. I will be writing to the Home Secretary today to ask her for further information about the appointment of Fiona Woolf.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. 20 years of records actually went missing between the years 1979 and 1999, and these allegations are actually, a lot of them are coming from this period of time. So it definitely feels that there could be some sort of correlation between these allegations. The police commissioner said that the public are imagining these links, and there probably isn't a link, but it seems doubtful that that's true, especially because the claims are coming from that same period of time.
Very interesting. Well, we'll leave it there at that, but of course we do appreciate that. That was Mohammed Walji speaking to us live from London.
She should, under British law now, be forced to abdicate, she and all her heirs, because she's, completely committed treason, in effect. Now, their backs are obviously to the wall on this, and they are now obviously getting some advice that I should be permanently silenced, because in order to stop this, which could lead to a whole chain of events which could topple the whole British monarchy. So, I'm not surprised in the way they're acting that way, but they've been striking at people around me as well. If you remember, 3 of our members over the last little while have been put in British or Canadian prisons on trumped-up charges. One man was put in a mental hospital for 3 days until we got him out. The fellow in London, David Compan. So, I mean, they've been hitting around us, but definitely this is aimed at trying to, stop this exposure of the direct link between the Vatican and the Crown.
But I think it's also going to be helpful to the public if we hear from Fiona Woolf again, and therefore I've written to her to ask her to come before the committee on Tuesday to clarify a number of points, but also to ensure that we get a reaction from her to what has happened over the last week.
You've had a report in the papers today.
Yes, this
about
is page one of the Daily Telegraph. You're going to refer to one of my callers. This is Johnny in Dulwich. Let me hand you this. Is a father claiming that Scotland Yard covered up a son's murder, reportedly involving a Conservative MP. This goes back some years, and this is a father, a retired magistrate, in an interview with that particular newspaper, the Daily Telegraph. How do you respond to that? As you say, this story takes on a fresh impetus each day.
I mean, each day. I mean, this is just the most. You can't think of a more serious and grotesque allegation that clearly needs to be looked into.
Are you aware of living paedophiles currently encircling Parliament?
I mean, there are several in Parliament at the moment.
Right.
And they're being blackmailed.
They are being blackmailed.
And it's a problem.
And by whom would they be blackmailed?
Well, it all goes back to Germany. The German intelligence are the classic users of paedophiles.
I think it's right, for instance, in other parts of the country that police officers are now under scrutiny and under the magnifying glass for not having acted in Rotherham, for instance. There's this real sense, as you've heard from the Ofsted report, that local authorities have not been alert to all of the killings.
Yeah, this is really a wholesale central intervention in the council. 5 commissioners who are going to report directly to Eric Pickles taking over these services. The council does have 14 days to make representations, but as you say, the cabinet has resigned, so it is unlikely that they will have much to complain about here. And then wholesale elections in 2016, so the people of Rotherham can elect an entirely new team that they can trust in. As you say, he said it was with a heavy heart because he would prefer to devolve responsibilities to councils, but he says this was a truly rare and exceptional case that left him with no choice.
Anushka, thank you very much indeed. Anushka Astana there with the very latest on that. Report that inquiry into abuse. 1,400 girls and young women is the estimate abused over a period of 16 years. An inquiry by Louise Casey deeming then the whole council not learned the lessons of its own inquiry, that it was not fit for purpose. Response there from the community secretary saying he is sending in central.
Very good afternoon. Rotherham Council has been condemned as not fit for purpose, failing victims of child sex abuse and failing to tackle their abusers. A disturbing report details the complete failure of leadership, an organisation struggling with sexism, bullying and misplaced political correctness.
The Germans understand paedophilia very well. Not saying all Germans are paedophiles, but
obviously
the German intelligence have always understood paedophilia, and they've also had a good understanding of human nature and human weakness. It partly goes back to Freud, who was one of their intelligence advisors. He was one of their psychiatric advisors. The Germans have always had brothels, male brothels in England. In the 1930s, they had 3. There was one in Oxford, one in Cambridge, and one in London.
Right.
And they also had female brothels as well. And
Interesting dispersal there, really, isn't it?
Well, yes, and it's not... London is the centre of power. Oxford and Cambridge are the centres of education, or were then. And, of course, what the Germans are doing is spotting future leaders.
Right.
Ebert Heath was recruited at Oxford. He was recruited at Balliol in 1937.
Right.
Ebert Heath first met Adolf Hitler in 1937.
The same name. Andrew and the underage sex slave. That's the headline in Britain's Daily Mail newspaper today, and there are variations of it on almost every front page. They're referring to one of the Queen's sons, Prince Andrew, 5th in line to the throne. And so serious are the allegations against him that Buckingham Palace has taken the unusual step of issuing a media statement to say that, and I quote, any suggestion of impropriety with underage minors is categorically untrue. The accusations against him are made in court papers in the United States by a woman who claims she was forced to have underage sex with Prince Andrew by his friend, the wealthy American banker Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein has already spent just over a year in prison after being allowed to strike a plea bargain in which he admitted 2 charges of sex with someone who was underage. But there's now a long-running and complicated legal case in which a number of women claim that plea bargain was struck unlawfully. One of the women who was identified in the British newspapers today is only referred to as Jane Doe 3 in the court papers. She's made allegations not only against Prince Andrew, but also against the former Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz. The BBC's Sarah Montague spoke to him last night when he denied the allegations and complained that they were made in court papers that don't even ask for a hearing to try to prove them.
So I think the recall will be helpful in order to determine precisely where she wants to go in respect of this matter. But at the moment, this is very much up to Mrs. Wolfe. She's now got an opportunity to reflect on her position, to look at what has happened since she gave evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee, and to make a decision herself as to what she thinks is in the best interests of this inquiry.
So it's no wonder that someone like Ian, who suffered abuse himself, feels that they have been ignored for far too long. We had the problem that the chair of the panel did not enjoy the confidence of people like Mr McFadden, and Theresa May has quite rightly said that we're not going to make that mistake again. The Home Office won't make that mistake again, and there'll be full consultation with groups representing the victims of abuse and survivors. We are, I think, in the early stages of really a kind of a reckoning with our kind of past, of things happening on a scale and of a gravity which just a few months ago would have seemed unimaginable. And
in the last half hour, the Council has announced that its entire cabinet has resigned. Here are some extracts from the report for you. It says the Council has ineffective leadership and management, a culture of covering up uncomfortable truths, silencing whistleblowers and paying off staff rather than dealing with difficult issues. Goes on to detail a pervading culture of sexism, bullying and silencing debate. The issue of race, it says, is contentious, with staff and members lacking the confidence to tackle difficult issues for fear of being seen as racism. It says this has helped fuel the far right and has increased racial tensions. Finally, as we let down victims, it says Rotherham Council has allowed the abusers to go unpunished. Little or no action is taken to stop or even disrupt their activities.
Well, first of all, they were made in court papers that don't even ask for a hearing to try to prove them. They put them in court papers in order to immunize themselves from any consequences of defamation suit. The story is totally made up, completely out of whole cloth. I don't know this woman. I was not at the places at the times. It's part of a pattern of made-up stories against prominent people and world leaders. And the lawyers, in a recent statement, challenged me to deny the allegations under oath. I am doing that. I am denying them under oath, thus subjecting myself to a perjury prosecution.
I was shocked by what we found and very, very concerned. We did think that on the back of Professor Jay's profound and important report that they themselves commissioned, that we would find a local authority that was much more open to change, much more open to the need to take action, and we didn't find that. The inspection team, of which I am the lead inspector, found that Rotherham Borough Council is not fit for purpose.
Well, I just wonder, on the strength of what you've just said, and you're talking about a timetable which takes us as far forward as Tuesday, potentially, when you would like to hear from her, given that we now have a group of survivors and survivors' representatives saying in the clearest terms that they do not want her to chair this inquiry, surely that takes us beyond anything that you've just described. She would have to reconsider her situation as of now, would she not?
Well, of course, we're not inviting her to come on Tuesday so she can resign in front of the committee. That's not the purpose of the committee.
And almost too horrific to contemplate. So I quite understand why Mr. McFadden and others would say we haven't been heard for many years. We must be listened to now. We need to constantly ask ourselves how we can involve them more fully as we peel back all the layers of deception that have covered up the past.
Horrible crimes. We know that she accused Bill Clinton of being on Jeffrey Epstein's private island and participating in a sex orgy with underage girls. The records of the Secret Service will prove that President Clinton never set foot on that island, so that she lied. Now, you know, it's possible to have a case of mistaken identification with somebody like me. It's impossible to have a case of mistaken identification with Bill Clinton.
And with Prince Andrew, because it has let the residents of Rotherham down, it's let its children down, and profoundly it continues to let historic and current victims of child sexual exploitation down. I did not anticipate this. It is not something that we have done lightly. We take it incredibly seriously. It's a sad day for public services, and the same.
What we want to do is to clarify any outstanding points. I was not at the meeting today, so I don't know what was said.
And come to terms with with the level of abuse that appears to have happened up and down the country, and make sure it never happens again.
He went out in the morning. His last words to me were, "Cheerio, Mum, have a nice day." That was it. Just to think that I won't see him anymore. That's the most difficult.
She will presumably get a report. The first and foremost consideration is for her to make a decision as to whether or not she wants to continue. I don't believe that anyone else can make that decision for her. She's heard the views of the victims' groups, which are, according to what you've just told me, pretty strong. She's heard our comments on the select committee at the hearing and what I've had to say on the 7 drafts of the letter that was sent from her to the Home Secretary.
Because Eileen suffers from one thing, she can't cry.
Well, I
Whereas
can, but I very rarely do.
As soon as I hear the music that Martin used to like, or a song, or it's his birthday, or 5th of November, I break down.
We obviously, I mean, you're clearly very angry at this. Are you able to say, and you say, you know, there were certain allegations made against Bill Clinton. What do you think of the allegations made against Prince Andrew?
My only feeling is that if she's lied about me, which I know to an absolute certainty she has, she should not be believed about anyone else. She's lied clearly about me. She's lied clearly about Bill Clinton. We know that. We know she's lied about other public figures, including a former prime minister and others who she claims to have participated in sexual activities with. So I think
that whole process was chaotic, really. It's for her. She needs to now consider what she has to say.
No, I get that, but what do you still need to clarify?
Not in front of everybody. I go out into the woods and I simply burst. After that, I'm all right. I can't help it.
I just want to know what did happen and to have a final closure. I mean, all right, it will never close out of my mind. It'll always be in my mind, but at least we can have a little family gathering just to say cheerio, and that's it.
He was a very good son, a very studious boy, never got aggressive in any way, and was a bookworm. very good at school, according to his reports, because he went to the same grammar school as I went. And they liked him, and they did quite a lot. There are some people out there
Somebody must know
just a little bit and have never said anything. And they may be the helper that we are looking for. That'll help us and our family to come to a bit of rest.
Well, there are a number of issues. For example, we have not put to her what the victims' groups have said. We can't, unfortunately, do it through the media. This has to be done in a proper and appropriate way. This is a parliamentary committee, so although, of course, we talk about these issues on the media, at the end of the day, people need to come before the committee to answer questions.
In a way, it remains a very sad day for victims of child sexual exploitation in Rotherham. They cannot consent to their own abuse. It is for us, in authority, in public service, to make sure that we do something about that, and in Rotherham, they did not do a good enough job. Over a very long period of time, Rotherham Borough Council has had a combination of unique factors, in my view. I don't necessarily think it is typical of local government at all. A leadership that couldn't get a grip of the problem of child sexual exploitation, didn't ask enough questions.
I think it must be presumed that all of our allegations against Prince Andrew are false as well, but I don't know. I wasn't there. I'm not a witness. I am a witness to my own life, and I will swear under oath, and I challenge them to swear under oath, that it did not happen.
Now, you are a professor of law. It is clear that you are going to use the law to try to clear your name from the allegations that have been made in these court papers. What would you advise Prince Andrew to do?
Well, I think he should clear the air as well. I think you can't allow these allegations to hang above you. The first question you have to ask yourself when you're charged with a crime like this is there any conceivable possibility you did it? And if the answer to that is no, then you have to fight back with every resource and ounce of energy available to you. Usually when people are charged with these kinds of things, there is some modicum of truth, some possibility that maybe they did something wrong and crossed the line. But if you're squeaky clean, and if you've never done anything like this, you must fight back with all the resources available to you, and that's what I will do. I will not rest or stop until the world understands not only that I had nothing to do with any of this, but that she deliberately, with the connivance of her lawyers, made up this story willfully and knowingly.
That was the prominent American lawyer, Professor Alan Dershowitz. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Marshall with NewsHour.
Or participant in any sexual activities whatsoever.
Have you met him with Jeffrey Epstein?
I met him. Jeffrey Epstein, if I'm not mistaken, was at Evelyn Rothschild's party. I've never been alone with Jeffrey.
Didn't take enough action. They didn't hold the police to account. They bring the Pakistani heritage community into disrepute. They, like me, like all of us, would want all criminals rooted out in any community and dealt with. So by wringing their hands, by being not able to deal with that issue, in many ways, in my view, they made it much worse.
Especially as they're not making themselves available in other respects.
Were I not telling the truth? I am now challenging them to have their client put these charges under oath, and for them to put them under oath. I am also challenging them to repeat them outside of the context of court papers so that I can sue them for defamation. I'm challenging her to file a criminal complaint against me because the filing of a false criminal charge, which this is, carries legal consequences. And so I want to see this played out, not only in the court of public opinion, but in the court of law.
We are very concerned about the timing of all that has happened. As you know, we were worried about the expertise that was displayed to us on Tuesday of last week, and we felt that this inquiry ought to have started already, given the lessons that had been learned or should have been learned.
And I will prove beyond any doubt not only that the story is totally false, but it was knowingly false, that the lawyers and the client conspired together to create a false story. That's why I am moving for their disbarment in challenges to be provided to the disciplinary committee.
Right. Professor Dershowitz, you are in the same situation as Prince Andrew in that, in fact, the allegations, the charge being made here effectively is that you had sex with Jane Doe 3, is how she's named in these papers, as did the allegations go Prince Andrew. And also it suggests here that you were witness to sexual abuse of other minors by Jeffrey Epstein.
And we're just hearing from the National Crime Agency. They have said there are a number of potentially criminal matters identified in Louise Casey's report into Rotherham Council. That no doubt means that they will be investigating as a result of Louise Casey's report. National Crime Agency saying they want to know more about a number of potentially criminal matters. Mike McCarthy is in Rotherham for us. Hello to you, Mike. Could these children and the parents of these children have been let down any further by this council?
Now, can you give us some sense, though, of why you are tied into this? Do you know Prince Andrew?
I met Prince Andrew on a number of public occasions. He came to my class at Harvard Law School and spoke to the students. I met him at a birthday party by Lord Evelyn Rothschild.
It's hard to imagine, isn't it, something that could be more damning of a local council in the United Kingdom.
But I've never been alone with Prince Andrew. I've never been at a party with any women with Prince Andrew, and I'm certainly not a witness or participant in any sexual activities whatsoever.
Have you met him with Jeffrey Epstein?
I met him. Jeffrey Epstein, if I'm not mistaken, was at Evelyn Rothschild's party.
I think the words of Louise Casey, who published this latest report, sum it all up when she says that Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council is not fit for purpose.
I've never been alone with Jeffrey Epstein and with Prince Andrew. No, never.
But you have represented Jeffrey Epstein in the past, haven't you?
After the Butler Schloss resignation, we thought this should have been handled in a more appropriate way. So it's process. It's now in her court. She must make a decision based on what has happened today. And you may be right. Matters may move on before Tuesday.
Because it's one thing you're effectively being put in the same situation as Prince Andrew, but you have been involved in this case. I mean, you say they are saying these things and what they are doing is wrong. They have said that they have tried to get testimony from you, but that you have avoided their deposition requests.
Totally false. That's totally false. I've never been asked to be deposed. I would be happy to be deposed. I'll be deposed today or tomorrow. I have absolutely nothing to hide. I will not answer questions about my legal relationship with a former client, of course. I'm not allowed to. But I will answer any and all questions about my personal life. I will absolutely, categorically, and honestly deny any sexual activity with whoever this woman is or with any underage person ever in my life.
She goes on to say as well at the end of the executive summary of her report, which is the core of that report, that Rotherham Council goes to some length to cover up and to silence whistleblowers. Rotherham Borough Council needs a fresh start. Now, as far as the victims of the sexual abuse in Rotherham are concerned, I think a lot of them may be saying today, and certainly the ones that we've spoken to are saying, this is shocking, but this is what we expected.
So I am not looking to avoid a confrontation. I'm looking to engage in confrontation with them. So I challenge them to depose me, to seek a hearing to prove these charges, and to accept the consequences when it's proved that it's totally false.
She's made some very serious charges here, but she has said these types of aggressive attacks on me are exactly the reason why sexual abuse victims typically remain silent, and the reason why I did for a long time. That trend should change. I'm not going to be bullied back into silence.
But that is what we've asked her to do,
so
because that's when we meet. We don't meet at weekends.
Indeed, no, I appreciate that. Just to be clear before we end the conversation, are you saying at this point she should stand down from this?
This is what we have sort of known all along, that it couldn't just be a question of councillors and council officials.
Nor will I be bullied into silence by false accusations against me. What does she expect me to do? Simply not respond? She has made a deliberate, willful, criminal, false charge. She is a 30-year-old, mature woman. I will defend myself against those charges. I don't know her. I don't want to know her, but I want to disprove those charges. She can't hide behind the fact that some people bully some victims.
It's up to her to decide. We didn't appoint her. We had no part in the process of appointing her. This was the Home Secretary's decision, and she took the advice of her civil servants, who were busy drafting letters for Mrs. Wolfe to write to their own boss. Now, I'm not going to...
The politicians and the administrators being neglectful, that it's far more than that, and that indeed is what Louise Casey has found today. I think one of the strongest points as well, and if you'll allow me just to give you a quote from...
To try to falsely charge me with a crime that I had nothing to do with.
They have made clear that actually their intention in naming both you and Prince Andrew, that effectively it's almost a side issue for them. Their concern was a particular deal that was struck where you were the lawyer for Jeffrey Epstein for a plea bargain.
One of the whistleblowers that Louise Casey quotes in turn in her report today. This is what the whistleblower had to say. I stepped forward on behalf of young people. It cost me my job and my career. I feel it was worth it. I'm proud to have done so, despite the cost to my health and financial situation.
That was made. It has been secret. It's not been made public. Would you encourage that it now be made public?
Of course. I want everything to be made public. I want every bit of evidence in this case to be made public. I want every allegation to be made public. I want to know who else she's accused of these horrors.
And this whistleblower, who is unnamed, goes on to say, the machine at Rotherham Council doesn't work, won't listen, and simply exists to cover up and destroy.
Tell people what to do. It's up to them to decide, but I think the weight of evidence is clear. She is a distinguished lawyer.
Well, I think another thing that the victims will be saying today is Rotherham Council, if they hadn't before, have finally met their match. Commissioners will be coming in, led by a managing director type figure. The whole of the council cabinet, as you say, Kay, has resigned, and effectively this council behind me now will be run by an outside body of people.
So when she looks at the balance sheet at the end of this week, I think she'll know what to do. She doesn't need me to tell her.
OK, that's clear. Keith Vaz, thank you very much indeed.
Instead of those elected to run it in Rotherham itself.
OK, Mike, for now, thanks very much indeed. Well, the MP, Sarah Champion, actually, I was chatting to her a couple of weeks ago when I was up in Rotherham just after Christmas. She talked about the Rotherham child sex abuse inquiry as it related to a previous report back in August. What she...
DJ in clubs and at Radio Caroline. And a friend of Jimmy Savile. And Terrett modelled his behaviour and his depravity on Savile.
He knew I was a kid. He could see I was a kid.
Kathy was 12 when Ray Terrett first raped her. She says that 20 years ago she told the police and social services, but her cries for help were ignored. Now she's waived her right to anonymity to speak out.
I just felt all these people and all the press and everything, you know, starstruck teenagers. How the hell dare they? They know nothing about what these girls and what we go through with people like him. They know nothing about what it does to us. We're not interested in bloody compensation.
Been saying about this latest one?
Very well researched, it's very robust, and I accept it in full, and I really welcome the intervention package that's being put in place, because
we're not interested in stories, we just want justice. They've wrecked our lives. Terrett wrecked my life.
In the 1960s and 70s, Terrett raped or indecently assaulted 11 schoolgirls. The youngest was 12. With the stage name Ugly Ray Terrett, the DJ traded off his celebrity rather than his looks. In the 60s, he'd stride around the dance floors of Manchester's teen discos, showering girls with attention and then taking them away to be raped. One 15-year-old girl was driven to a flat in Salford. She was raped by Terrett and says Jimmy Savile was there too.
Rotherham does deserve better. It has been let down. It is heartbreaking, but it is also disgusting, and every page has got a new horror on it.
Her lawyer, Liz Dux, says this case is the closest a court will come to putting Savile on trial.
They clearly operated together. Obviously, we don't know the essence of what was behind that relationship. But we do know in the way that Savile operated is that he used people as a conduit for his own sexual perversions, and this is probably another horrific example of that.
The police say that Terrett was convinced by his own megalomania that he'd never be caught.
What I would plea, though, is that the Secretary of State puts resources in place so that we can move forward. I've been asking for 5 months for resources specifically to help the young people move on with their lives.
His friend Savile escaped justice, but now Terrett does face prison. Well, on hearing of the convictions today, we're told by the police that some of Ray Terrett's victims have shown elation at the knowledge that he will now be imprisoned. Others say just how acutely this has brought back their experience to them, how deeply distressed they remain. And speaking for the Crown Prosecution Service, Nazir Afzal, who's the chief Crown Prosecutor in the North West, commended the enormous bravery, he said, of all of these women in coming forwards to the police and in coming to court to speak out about what had happened.
And we're not getting that. We need that. What I would like to do, though, is for this House to recognise that this came about because of the tenacity of the survivors who kept coming forward and kept highlighting over years and years and years.
He has put these convictions down to their collective courage. As for Ray Terrett, well, tonight he is in jail. He is facing a sentence, but he will discover what that sentence is to be when he's sentenced next Thursday.
Judith Moritz reporting.
Important to go to the courtroom, to go and give that evidence.
It's saying to him and the likes of him, how dare you do what you did to me? How dare you? That was my life.
But it can't have been an easy thing to have done.
It was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. But I've done it. And it was worth it, and everyone's got a right to do that, to say to people like him, you can't do this, you can't get away with this.
How they were being let down, and what I want to say is that they are champions now because they have caused the change that we so dearly needed for our town.
That's Kathy talking to our reporter Judith Moritz. Well, Liz Dux is a child abuse specialist for the law firm Slater and Gordon. She represents one of the women that Ray Terrett abused and also more than 170 of Jimmy Savile's victims. Liz, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How important is this conviction?
Well, hugely important. Firstly, for the Savile victims, we know that Savile raped one of these victims at the same time as Terrett, and so it is the closest that the victims are ever going to get to there being a conviction against Savile. So it's hugely important for the Savile victims. But also, as you heard from Kathy there, it's hugely important for all victims of horrific sex crimes that took place many decades ago, who've been brave enough to come forward to give their evidence in court in horrific circumstances and to show that they can still achieve justice so many years on. So it's...
Well, I agree with everything the Honourable Lady said, and I do. It's certainly my intention.
Eric Pickles agreeing with the MP for Rotherham, Sarah Champion, talking about this latest report.
Very, very important. And again, it shows that celebrity and influence and power will not override justice.
It's sad, really, isn't it, Liz, that Ray Terrett had a conviction of sexual intercourse with an underage girl years and years ago, which the police say wasn't really widely reported, and nothing ever came of that the way that it came about this time.
Yes, it is, and I suspect it's only when people started coming forward after the Savile revelations and gave more evidence against Terrett that he was reinvestigated. And as we hear from Kathy, people are taking these allegations much more seriously now. They are listening to victims' evidence with much greater sensitivity, and that is very, very important, that victims feel that they can still come forward even now and give evidence, and that they still will achieve justice.
How does your client feel today, Liz?
Into the goings-on at Rotherham Council. The whole of the Cabinet Council has now resigned, and the latest we're hearing is that the National Crime Agency is saying a number of potentially criminal matters have been unearthed as a result of this latest Rotherham Council.
Well, the giving of evidence in court will have been absolutely traumatic for her. She'll have lived with this for many, many years, not able to tell anyone. The shame of it on these young girls, as you heard from Kathy there, I think they all felt very, very similar. And today will hopefully give some sort of closure. I'm very pleased that the judge has adjourned the sentencing until next week, and so he can take into account the effect that these assaults have had on the girls' lives. That's very, very important, that the sentence reflects the damage that has been done.
Liz Dux, thank you, a child abuse specialist from the law firm Slater and Gordon, who represents one of the women that Ray Terrett abused.